There are people who walk into their homes and exhale. And there are people who walk into their homes and feel something tighten inside them. Not because the place is filthy, not because they are lazy, not even because the mess is especially dramatic, but because something in that room feels like evidence. Evidence that life has been slipping, evidence that energy has been leaking, evidence that the promises they keep making to themselves are not being kept. And that is why, for some people, clutter hurts in a way that is hard to explain. It is not just visual, it is not just practical, it is not even just stressful, it is personal. Because after a certain point, a messy room stops feeling like a room. It starts feeling like a reflection, a quiet one, a humiliating one, the kind that says something about you before you even say anything about yourself. And that is the first thing most people miss about this subject. You do not hate cleaning as much as you think you do. What you actually hate is the feeling of looking around and sensing that your environment is speaking on your behalf and saying something you do not want to hear. That is why this conversation is deeper than organization, deeper than discipline, deeper than good habits. Because a home is never just a container for your things. It is often the physical record of how you have been relating to yourself. And once you see that, the question changes. The question is no longer, why can I keep my house clean? The question becomes, why does the state of my space affect the way I feel about my own life so much? That is where this gets psychologically interesting. Because the answer is not simple, but it is intimate. A room can become heavy for reasons that have very little to do with the room itself. You can be exhausted from work, from noise, from people, from the constant friction of being alive in a world that never stops asking things from you. And then you come home hoping, perhaps without even realizing it, that home will do one thing for you: let you stop. Let your nervous system come down. Let your mind unclench. Let your body feel that something is handled. But when you walk into a space full of half-finished signals, that is not what happens. The chair with clothes on it, the dishes you meant to wash, the counter that has become a holding place for delayed decisions, the corner of the room you keep pretending you no longer notice. None of these things are loud on their own, but together they create a psychological atmosphere, not chaos in the dramatic sense. Something subtler than that. Unfinishedness. And unfinishedness is expensive. Your mind does not only process objects, it processes implications. It reads what is complete and what is pending, what is settled and what is still asking for you, what can be ignored and what continues to hum in the background. William James once wrote that our experience is what we agree to attend to. And that is part of the problem. Because clutter is not only what you are looking at, it is what keeps asking for a fraction of your attention, even when you are trying not to give it any. A room full of unresolved signals creates a kind of low-grade cognitive friction. You may not consciously think about the shirt on the floor or the unopened mail or the dishes in the sink every second, but your system registers that something remains undone. And when enough things remain undone in the place where you are supposed to recover, the room stops functioning as shelter. It begins functioning as psychic carryover. This is why some people feel more tired at home than they do outside of it. Not because home is objectively worse, but because a home has become a second conversation with everything they were already struggling to hold together. That is the part many people feel, but rarely articulate. They say, I can't relax. They say, I don't know why I feel so on edge. They say, I come home and I still feel like I have not arrived. But often what they mean is this: my environment does not let me put my life down for a moment. And once a space stops giving you rest, it starts doing something else. It starts shaping your self-perception. Because human beings do not live in neutral environments for long. We interpret them. We make meaning out of them. And then, without meaning to, we make identity out of that meaning. That is when the real pain begins. The real pain is not the mess itself. The real pain is the story the mess starts telling. I am the kind of person who cannot maintain things. I always let things slide. I am behind. I cannot seem to keep up. I start with good intentions and then disappear from my own life again. Now the room is no longer a room, it is a verdict. And this is why clutter often carries more shame than it seems like it should, because it does not just confront you with objects, it confronts you with a version of yourself, a version that feels inconsistent, undisciplined, neglectful, scattered, maybe even defeated. That is why this subject touches something so private. A messy house is not only inconvenient, for many people, it is the place where they keep meeting the self they are afraid might be real. And yet, that is still not the deepest layer. Because if that were all, the issue would be mostly about shame. But for many people, it is also about control. Not in the dramatic sense, not domination, not perfectionism, at least not yet. Something more basic. The need to feel that there is still one corner of reality that responds to you. Life is unstable in ways that the nervous system never fully gets used to. People change. Plans collapse. News arrives, time disappears, energy drops. Things happen that cannot be controlled, predicted, or repaired on the timeline you want. And in that atmosphere, a very small act can become psychologically enormous. Wiping a counter, making a bed, putting something back where it belongs. On the surface, these are tiny behaviors. Underneath, they can carry a very different message. Something in my life still moves when I move. Something still responds to care. Something is still within reach. Albert Bandura spoke about self-efficacy, our belief that we can produce an effect through our own actions. And this matters more than many people realize, because when life feels too large, too abstract, too unmanageable, the mind often reaches for concrete proof that agency still exists. A clean surface can become that proof, not because it is morally superior, not because neat people are better people, but because order in a small domain can restore a felt sense of authorship. You act, the environment changes, your body receives the message. I am not completely powerless here. That is one of the hidden reasons some people maintain clean spaces so consistently. It is not that they love wiping things down. It is not that they find endless joy in housework. It is not that they wake up every day intoxicated by countertops. It is that somewhere along the way, they learn that tending to their environment stabilizes something inside them. For some, this learning was conscious. For others, it was implicit. But the pattern is the same. Outer order becomes a way of regulating inner noise. And this is where many people make the wrong assumption. They look at people with orderly homes and think, they must have more discipline. But discipline is often the least interesting explanation, because what you are usually seeing is not brute force. You are seeing an identity that no longer negotiates with itself every time a small task appears. This is one of the deepest shifts in human behavior. A behavior that feels punishing when it is foreign can feel natural when it becomes self-concept. In other words, once something becomes part of who you believe you are, it stops feeling like an endless moral test. You no longer perform the action in order to become acceptable. You perform it because it already belongs to the version of you that feels true. That is why the distinction between discipline and identity matters so much. If you believe you are just a messy person, then every act of care feels temporary, artificial, even dishonest. You clean, but the identity beneath the action remains untouched. And so the old pattern returns because the deeper narrative was never interrupted. But if the action begins to accumulate as evidence, something changes. Not all at once, not dramatically, but enough. You wipe the table, you put the dish away, you make one corner of the room coherent again. And somewhere beneath conscious thought, your mind begins revising its picture of you. Maybe I am not someone who always lets things collapse. Maybe I am someone who can return. Maybe I am someone who can maintain. Maybe I can be trusted with my own life in small ways. That shift matters because identity is rarely transformed by declarations. It is transformed by repeated evidence. Carl Jung said that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. And many people call themselves messy as if it were fate. But often it is not fate. It is a rehearsed self-concept. A role repeated until it feels inevitable. A story stabilized by the evidence of neglected spaces, which means the space is not just where you live. It is where a certain version of you keeps getting confirmed. And now the question becomes unsettling. If identity is living in the room before you do, then whose identity is organizing your home right now? The person you're becoming, or the person you quietly gave up and became loyal to years ago? That is not a small question, because many people are not living in homes shaped by their values. They're living in homes shaped by fatigue, avoidance, shame, and the inertia of an old self-image. And the tragedy is that they often interpret the result morally. I need more willpower. I need to get it together. I need to stop being like this. But shame is one of the worst architects of sustainable change. Shame does not usually create consistency. It creates hiding. It creates all or nothing cycles. It creates the familiar pattern of intense cleaning followed by collapse, followed by guilt, followed by more avoidance. That is why the discipline framing fails so many people. It mistakes a relational problem for a character defect. Because at the center of this is not simply laziness or orderliness, it is your relationship to care, to routine, to self-trust, to whether your actions feel like punishment or protection. And that brings us to a darker, more honest question. Not all clean homes come from health. Some come from fear. Some people create beautiful, silent, perfectly ordered spaces, not because those spaces soothe them, but because they cannot tolerate uncertainty, because disorder feels like danger, because stillness is unbearable unless everything is controlled, because if the room is immaculate, perhaps the anxiety inside can be temporarily disguised. This matters because otherwise we turn cleanliness into a virtue and clutter into a vice. And human psychology is almost never that simple. There is a form of order that heals, and there is a form of order that hides. One gives the nervous system permission to rest. The other demands more performance. One feels like being held. The other feels like being monitored. One says, "You can exhale now." The other says, "Do not make a mistake." So the real distinction is not between messy people and clean people. It is between environments governed by care and environments governed by fear. If your space becomes more orderly and you feel softer, calmer, more able to inhabit yourself, that is care. If your space becomes more orderly and you feel more rigid, more vigilant, more unable to sit down until everything is perfect, that is not peace. That is anxiety wearing elegant clothes. And this is important because many people have lived inside this confusion for years. They think the goal is perfection. They think the goal is spotless. They think the goal is to become the kind of person whose life never spills over. But perfection has very little to do with peace. A healthy space does not make you feel that you must deserve to enter it. A healthy space makes you feel received by it. That is the standard. Not flawlessness, not aesthetics, not image. Relief. If your environment does not let you rest, something is off, whether the room is cluttered or pristine. And now we can say something more precise. The psychological value of an orderly home is not that it proves you are superior. It is that when it is healthy, it functions as embodied reassurance. It tells the body, things are handled enough. Nothing here is accusing you. You do not need to brace right now. That is why small rituals in a space can matter so much. Not because they optimize you, not because they make you a better capitalist version of yourself, but because they help create internal coherence. Daniel Kahneman wrote about the difference between experiencing self and remembering self. One lives moment to moment. The other builds the story of who we are. Your environment affects both. It shapes your felt experience in real time, and it contributes to the story you keep gathering about the kind of person you are. Do I live in a way that is always one step behind my own life? Or do I live in a way that leaves evidence of care behind me? That question is not really about dishes, it is about dignity. And dignity is where this becomes most human. Because for many people, the issue is not productivity. It is not optimization. It is not becoming a tidier person. It is the quiet grief of no longer knowing how to make life feel inhabitable. A cluttered room can become painful because it suggests something larger. I do not know how to hold myself together right now. And if that is true for you, then the answer is not to shame yourself into becoming different overnight. The answer is to stop making the problem larger than the doorway through which change can actually enter. This is where most advice fails. It asks for a transformation when what is needed first is a repair of trust. And trust is rebuilt in units small enough that the nervous system does not resist them. So do not start with the whole house. The whole house is too symbolic, too heavy, too full of history. Start with one corner, one shelf, one table, one sink. One chair that has stopped being a chair and become a confession booth for postponed decisions. Not because this is a life hack, not because tiny habits are trendy, though BJ Fogg has shown how small behaviors are often the only ones that survive long enough to reshape identity. Start small because small is where resistance cannot hide behind grand drama. And more importantly, start small because you are not trying to prove you can dominate your life. You are trying to give self-trust somewhere to return. That is a different project entirely. Do not ask, how do I become a clean person? Ask, can I create one space that no longer betrays me when I look at it? That question is gentler, more precise, and psychologically truer. Because when one area of your environment becomes reliable, something subtle happens. You walk into the room differently. Your shoulders change. Your eyes soften. Tomorrow feels slightly less hostile. You begin gathering evidence that you can keep a small promise to yourself. And that matters more than people think. Because people do not usually lose themselves in one dramatic collapse. They lose themselves through repeated micro experiences of self-betrayal. I will do it later. I will fix it tomorrow. I will come back to it. I will come back to myself. And then tomorrow becomes a landscape full of leftovers from the person you were too tired to be for. That is why one maintained corner can do more than clean 10 rooms in a burst of guilt. It can interrupt the story. It can say, not everything is falling apart. Not everything is abandoned. There is still one place where care arrives on time. That is a profound psychological event. Because the first thing that changes is not the room. It is the relationship between you and your own follow-through. And once that relationship changes, the room is no longer just a room. It becomes evidence of return. Not perfection, return. That word matters. Because many people do not need to become better. They need to come back. Back to a sense of authorship. Back to the feeling that their choices still land somewhere. Back to a version of care that is not theatrical, not performative, not for guests, not for social media, not for an image. Just real, quiet, private, protective. A home at its best is not a display of standards. It is a place where your inner life is either being supported or slowly undermined. And once you understand that, you stop asking the wrong question. You stop asking, why can't I be like those people who always have it together? And you start asking something far more honest. What is my space teaching my body every day? What identity is it reinforcing? What story about my worth, my energy, my agency, my ability to care for myself is being repeated every time I walk through the door? Because your home is always saying something, even when it is silent. It may be saying, nothing here is settled. You are behind. You do not really take care of things. Rest is not available yet. Or it may be saying, you are allowed to arrive here. Something has already been handled. You do not have to fight the room before you can feel your own life again. That difference is not decorative. It is psychological, it is relational, and often it is existential. Because the state of a home can become a private philosophy, a material answer to the question, what do I believe I deserve to come back to? That may be the deepest layer of all. Not whether you're tidy, not whether you are efficient, not whether you are disciplined enough, but whether some part of you still believes your life is worth preparing a place for. And if the answer feels uncertain, do not panic. Uncertainty is not failure, it is information. It may simply mean that your problem was never mess. It was disconnection, exhaustion, shame, an old identity, a nervous system that stopped expecting relief. A part of you that no longer believed small acts of care could mean anything, but they do. Not because they solve everything, not because a clean room heals trauma, not because organization replaces therapy, rest, grief, or truth, but because sometimes a small external order is the first visible form an inner return can take. And perhaps that is why this subject lingers. Because beneath all the talk of clutter and cleanliness is a quieter question. When a person stops taking care of their space, what have they stopped believing about themselves? And when they begin again, even in one tiny corner, what exactly is being restored? Maybe not control in the grand sense, maybe not transformation, maybe not a whole new life, maybe just this. The feeling that they have not completely lost the thread. The feeling that they can still create one small place where life does not accuse them. The feeling that their presence still has the power to make something gentler. So, yes, a messy home is never just a mess. Sometimes it is fatigue made visible. Sometimes it is shame made spatial. Sometimes it is grief with nowhere else to go. Sometimes it is the nervous system telling the truth before the mouth does. And sometimes the act of bringing order back is not about becoming impressive. It is about becoming reachable again. Reachable to yourself. Trustworthy to yourself. Habitable to yourself. Which is why the final question is not whether you keep your house clean. The final question is whether the life you return to each day feels like a place that still knows how to receive you. Because keeping one corner of a room in order can be the beginning of self-trust. But the harder question, the one that waits underneath all of this, is this. What made so many people lose self-trust in the first place?